So we've installed vCenter and we've connected to it with our vSphere client and we've added our first host. As we can see from a host perspective, it's very similar to what we observed on a non-vCenter managed host. We have our host of virtual machines, we have some performance details, although the performance details are going to be quite different when using vCenter compared to a host directly. And then we also have configuration details, and those will actually look exactly the same as what we had previously, and any settings that we had before will just come over automatically. So we have tasks and events and alarms and so on, and really effectively what we had previously. Let's go back to the home page. We're going to take a look at templates in a later video, as well as the data store and networking functions. Let's take a look at the vCenter server settings themselves. So if I click on that under administration, you can see that we have the option to put in additional licenses, and then we can start assigning those licenses to particular hosts. We also have some tuning that we can do effectively in how we collect and gather and store performance details. What we've got here is a couple of different levels of statistics. You'll see that for 5-minute windows, we're going to keep, for 1 day, statistics at level 1. Let's click Edit here. And what we can see actually is that statistics level 1 includes the basic metrics. So average usage for CPU, memory, disk, and network, uptime, heartbeat, DRS metrics, and so on. We'll talk about a lot of this in the performance video. But as you can see, it's actually the least amount of performance data that we could gather. So we may want to increase that to level 2, where we can see we get all metrics for CPU, memory, disk, and network. And if we go up to level 3, we get all metrics for all devices, for all the counter groups. And if we go to level 4, you can see everything possibly supported by vCenter, which I don't think there's actually that much of a difference between level 3 and level 4 effectively. But let's see what happens if we do that. So if I was to put that to level 4 and say that I want to keep statistics not for 5-minute windows, but for 1-minute windows, because I have lots of very short spikes in activity or something, and I want to keep that for 5 days, well, of course, now we're generating much, much more data. So let's see. Before, the estimate of our database size, I believe, was 14 gigs. So we can now see that we went from about 14 gigs of statistics to 955 gigs if we had 50 hosts and 2,000 virtual machines. So depending on how much statistics you want to collect, then we're obviously going to have to plan for database size. One of your most limiting factors here is going to be if you're using SQL Server Express, the maximum database size is 10 gigs. In earlier versions, the maximum database size was only 4 gigs. So you could see even in this case, we would already be running into difficulty there. So turning up the statistics to that point are really not necessary and it's not really appropriate. But one of the things you'll notice is that you can't set the other statistics, you can't set them to a higher level than the next interval above them. So I can't say that I want to keep for 1-minute periods data at level 1 and then for a 30-minute period at level 4, for example. So in this case, let me just put it back. If I do that now and I try to increase one of the other intervals to a higher level, it's actually going to tell me that I can't do that. But it's really the lowest level interval that's really going to cost you in terms of data. If you wanted to get a higher degree of data at a certain level without generating quite as much information, I suppose the other thing that you may do is turn on or off some of these intervals. As you'll see, you can't turn off a lower level and still keep its higher level enabled, and it'll just automatically select all of those for you. So in addition to those performance statistics that we can specify how we want them stored or what kind of roll-ups we want to do on them, we'll also see under runtime settings, we can specify what IP address we're associating with vCenter. We shouldn't really need to worry about this. But again, if we have a very complex network environment, we can associate particular IPs with vCenter as opposed to others. Although it's still fairly basic, you can't really bind to a whole bunch of IP addresses here. We can also set query limits and validation settings for Active Directory. If we have large numbers of Active Directory users, having it pull back the entire list of users when we go to add someone for permissions or something is not necessarily appropriate. So you can see that by default here, it will limit in the Add Permissions dialog 5,000 users and groups, which I think will probably be enough. And you'll also notice the validation, the number of minutes to wait before performing a sync and validation. This is actually fairly important because if you make changes to Active Directory, the VMware sync actually has to go back and do that garbage cleanup process, which Active Directory does automatically on its own and Windows automatically does. VMware will also do, but we can set a time period for this here. I've made changes and expected to have them happen quickly, but as you can see, it takes a while. Now, you can also turn off validation. I'd say that's a bad idea because then we're never going to clean up objects that have been removed from the directory. We'll leave them on, but you could tune them as necessary. If you want to have vCenter send out email to you, you're going to have to provide the details of your email server. As you can see, nothing overly complicated here, but we don't have any options for authentication. So your SMTP server is going to have to allow anonymous relay either for the IP address of the vCenter server or potentially as open to the subnet or something. If you're using some sort of SNMP, Simple Network Monitoring Protocol management suite, then we can specify the details for the communities and the trap locations that we want to use. You can see the ports here, but as you can see, you can't change them. If you go into timeout settings, this is one thing that you may find can be a little tricky. Sometimes you'll do something in vCenter, but vCenter doesn't really perform the work. vCenter actually just tells the host what to do and then tries to get a status back from the host on what happened. Sometimes you'll have jobs that say that they've timed out in vCenter. If we look at that recent tasks at the bottom of the screen, it'll say that it's timed out, but it's not actually necessarily that the task is finished or that it was stopped or canceled on the actual host, but simply that vCenter is no longer able to monitor that job. For example, keeping the number of snapshots associated with a virtual machine can reduce the amount of time it takes to remove snapshots and consolidate them, but if you have many snapshots, it could take several minutes. But as you can see here, a normal operation will time out after 30 seconds, a long operation after 120 seconds. I would say increasing those is worthwhile. We can also set some additional logging options. So once again, if we're troubleshooting a problem, we may want to increase the amount of detail that we're collecting. We probably wouldn't want to leave it this way all the time. If you want to get less information in the logs and you only want to log warnings and errors or just errors, we could change the setting here. I'm just going to leave it as is. If we take a look over at the database, you'll see as well there's a maximum number of database connections. If you have many users accessing vCenter, we're going to need to increase this number, although I'm never going to have 50 people on my vCenter, so I'm not too worried about that. We have the database retention policy. In order to keep the size of the database down, we can actually have it trim back some of the old data that's no longer needed. So details about tasks that we ran or events that we ran, we can have them removed. Generally, better to have vCenter handle those things for us. And then if there's other additional advanced settings that we want, we can configure them here, but we shouldn't really need to set these for most purposes and most configurations. So that gave us an idea as to some of the settings for vCenter itself. We're going to take a look at some of these again when we talk about alerts and performance later on. You can see there's a few other areas here that we'll take a look at in other videos as well. We'll get system logs, scheduled tasks, and permissions, and so on. Some of these we won't really ever look at. For example, the storage environment that I'm working in is really very simple, so we're not going to get into storage providers and VM storage profiles and things like that. Although we will take a look at the customization specifications manager for deploying from templates.